First, I have to say I'm very inspired by your speech or your talk. And I'm glad you brought up science, because one of the things happening in Singapore is that there's a lot of research and money put into bio and genetic engineering.
Sure.
And the thing is that it's led mainly by industry. As a Buddhist, I actually am very confused about how to view this. So that's one question. I know in Europe and Europe more than America, they are very much against, for example, genetically modified foods.
Yes.
Over here, nobody has an opinion about GMOs and genetic engineering. Nobody has an opinion because science is done behind closed doors, and the public are not educated enough to have a debate about these issues. So that's one area I need to understand the Buddhist perspective on this. The second thing I want to say is that, related to the gentleman's question over there, I think one of the stumbling blocks for Buddhists in being socially engaged and being in politics, for example, to make change, is that very sort of strong philosophy that says we have to change ourselves before we can change the world.
That's right.
And I find personally for myself I also have this dilemma. I mean, because it's like, you have to understand emptiness, etc., and also all sorts of things, and then before you can go in and try to talk about Buddhism to other people, because we do not want to evangelize. And the problem with the Christian conservative is that they evangelize. So that these are my two areas. Thank you.
Yeah. Points you raise are again complex and need to be discussed. I would say that the issue which we will face constantly is that every time you have new technology, you have to eventually invent the ethic to go with it. It's like when the computer came along, a friend of mine who was one of the leaders for opening up the computer world and ran a large computer division, said to me, "We don't yet have an ethic for the virtual. Does it matter what you do to the virtual environment? Because after all, it's just virtual, right? And so, therefore, you can play any kind of trick you want in the virtual, and you can put out a virus which is going to destroy everybody's data, and nobody thought it was anything but funny. There was no ethic. It takes a while for the new technology to have an ethic because you got to have the experience of the technology. It's not easy to say, how should we pass rules for this new technology and deal with it? It's the same with genetic engineering of plants. This is new technology. We have no ethic for it yet. We really have not yet had time to develop. And that's why discourse and participation and trying to understand it is so important for people, so that eventually out of that discussion grows the new ethic, which becomes the norm for dealing with that particular technology. Same with genetics. If you can clone, why don't you clone everything, including humans? But then we say, well, we don't yet know what the ethic is for cloning, because we don't know what it really implies. It's a very complex situation. We need to think seriously about what cloning really means. So the world is filled with all this new technology coming at us in an unprecedented deluge of new technology for which we have no ethic. No wonder we struggle so much with it. We don't know what's the ethic of social networking? What's the ethic with porno? What's the ethic with children on the internet? What's the ethics of all of this? that has to be really discussed and worked at until we can reach a place where we have a reasonable understanding of it. So I don't think it's going to happen just by passing laws. I think part of it always grows out of the experience of people and what they, from their experience, eventually decide this is what you need to do. And then they start teaching their children this is what you need to do. You don't create a virus, and you certainly don't promulgate that virus because that's really bad. But there was a whole generation where it was fun because there was no ethic. So we're in a state where we're having to develop new ethics. And so what is the ethic for dealing with the virtual world is to say, from one point of view, the Buddhists actually have run up against this all the time. Because the Buddhist perception is a virtual perception. I don't have fire in my brain. I have a construct that is a virtual reality construct in my brain. My little signal that runs up my hand when I touch a hot stove and goes into my brain and gives me ouch, that's virtual. It's not fire. It's not fire in my brain. So the Buddhists of all the groups have the best chance of trying to talk to people about what is the reality that you have to deal with virtual. Because in terms of the teaching about perception, it's all virtual reality. That's what we live in all the time. And we've known for a very long time in Buddhism that you got to have an ethical and moral basis that goes along with the virtual experience. So you can say, well, you're just a figment of my imagination, but the Buddhists never say that. Buddhists never say there's not an external world. People misrepresent Buddhism all the time. All the Buddhists say is, my experience of you is not you. The light that has bounced off of you, my eyes have taken in, and I have created you. And it looks, my brain is so wonderful, it really looks like what I'm experiencing is you out there. It's perfect. It's a perfect virtual reality in which the brain operates. And yet, for my real experience is in that synapses in my brain. That's where it's really happening, but it sure doesn't look that way. So Buddhism's going to have to help people understand this new technological world, in a sense, is simply bringing now into a mechanical age the Buddhist concept of how we perceive. It's not really that new for Buddhism.
With regard to this concern about Buddhist information they have brought to us tonight,
yes.
I want to ask has anything being done at the leadership level in the Buddhist environment? Is there any organization that people talk about it? Because like anything to take effect, we must have leaders to bring this about.
Well, the Buddhists have been pretty good with the new technology, I must say this. The Buddhists have digitized their canons, they have created websites, they have used DVDs. You think of all the things which the Buddhist groups have used. It's not that Buddhism has been remiss by any means. I would not imply that. However, I think that what's happened not just to Buddhists but to all of us is this information age is now growing and becoming more and more dominant, and we don't know quite how to handle it. Last night I spoke to a Buddhist group and I told them, in a way, information today is like putting together a crossword, a jigsaw puzzle. And in the past, you had a number of pieces and you put them all in the right place and you get a beautiful picture, right? But the problem is that we're getting so much information that our jigsaw puzzle of information that we try to put together, during the night, all the pieces grow far apart because there's all this new information that is unaccounted for in the pieces. And we can't put it back together easily. We are in this expanding picture, and we're trying desperately to put in new pieces. Just think how many disciplines have grown up around the genetics. If you look at all the sub-disciplines of the genetics, I mean, they turn out a new discipline every night, and it's still not enough. You can't hold on to all the data because it's just enormous. So we're in a new age, truly, really. And it's an age of information. So I believe there's only one way that we can handle such vast information, and that is that we have to visualize it. You can't read it anymore. You got to see it as graphs and maps and all that kind of visuals. We're going to have to learn how to live with a visual world because the brain is 41% wired for visual. And the brain is going to demand that we give it a visual so it can understand huge amounts of data. A lot of changes are going to have to come. But Buddhist leadership, they've asked me to come and give the keynote address at the UN Day of Vesak in Bangkok next month. And have asked me to speak about much of what I've been saying tonight. So they are aware. They are beginning to ask people to come and speak to them about these issues. They're interested. Buddhist colleges, Buddhist groups like yours are beginning to try to explore and become informed about the issues. So I think that you need not just to hear Buddhist speakers all the time. You need to hear some people who come in who are working at the level of information science, genetics. Bring them in. Talk to them. What's happening in the genetics? What's your ethical behavior that you think should happen? And they need to hear what you have to say. See, with DNA, I think really what DNA is karma. It's the mechanism of how change passes on in a continuity from one time to another. That's what it is. We have a mechanism now that we can talk about. We didn't have that mechanism before. Now we have a mechanism.
Now we can change karma.
Now we can change. And if we look at karma from the Buddhist perspective, then we see that it was always very complex. It wasn't just rebirth. Karma never said there's a one-to-one. And if they do say that in those texts, I think they can't hold on to it. It's always one-to-many. One cause had many, many effects. Because it's one-to-many, you can't predict. You don't know which one of them it's going to hit. So causality is the crisis. Cosmology is another crisis. And genetics. We have these crises. They're really crises. But they're also have excitement with them too. It's not all bad.